Hi, my name is Matt Bromley. I am an electronic musician, composer, producer, sonic artist, and what you have just heard is an example of a little passion project that I've been working on this summer, which is a hand-controlled Pulsar synth. And my intention today is, at this kind of milestone coming towards the end of the summer, is just to share what I have been working on with you as a chance to perhaps start a bit of a conversation. I have been learning Max MSP and Touch Designer as I go along with this project. It's been a really exciting way to learn those technologies, but I'm sure that as a result there may be technical things that people will have some thoughts and suggestions about, but also the kind of creative and artistic aspects of what I'm doing here. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts and feedback. Certainly from my point of view, I feel like I've reached this point at the end of the summer where I've got a whole bunch of really interesting core technologies working, which is amazing. But also there's this really kind of clear sense that this technology could be used in a number of different applications, and I'm really interested in exploring what those could be and how I might take this synth forward. And so if this video hopefully starts a bit of a conversation about that, that would be really exciting. So let me walk you through what I have done and what I've got. So I've got a Rolly C board, that is my MIDI controller. I do have a sustain pedal connected to that allows me to hold notes whilst my hands are controlling other parameters. And then I have got a microphone here. And then software wise, coming over the laptop, you can see that I have got Max MSP, I have got Touch Designer, and his photo booth just so you can see me. So Touch Designer is what's handling the gesture-based input. At the moment, I'm using a fairly rudimentary version of that, and I'm using the free version of Touch Designer. I'm using a plugin called MediaPipe, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm getting out of MediaPipe the hand tracking data, and essentially I'm just sending that over the network, internal network, to Max MSP. And that's where I'm doing my processing. Once I'm in Max MSP, let's just follow that chain through. So I am receiving from the network. In this case, I'm literally just making use of two gestures. I have had some other versions working where I'm making use of further gestures to control certain parameters. But for now, I've been, and at this stage, just I've gotten to the place where I'm using two gestures. And essentially what each of those two gestures is doing, each closed fist is triggering a sampling process. One for A and one for B. And I've got two sample buffers, Pulse A and Pulse B, and you'll see those in a second. So what I am recording through the microphone will be sampled. I do have a vocal chain set up here so that you can hear what is coming through the microphone. And I'm using some third-party plugins just to do some processing on that. I'm using Little Alter Boy, some reverb. And then what I have got is so the heart of this synth is this approach to synthesis called pulsar synthesis. This is the idea that you can take one cycle of sound, a frequency, and you can split that up into a pulse of sound and a pulse of silence. And that could be 50-50, that could be different amounts, but that's the basic fundamental principle. And so what I am doing is taking a short sample, in this case through the vocal chain, grabbing that sample with my hand, and I'm using that to become my pulse, and that would be pulse A. The second, which is the silence, I am actually allowing myself to be able to put a second sample in there, and that's what the second hand is capturing, a second sample, and that can then become that second pulse. Either that could be a pulse of silence, or in this case a second sample. And so what I've got two pulses. They are receiving the samples. I can choose where within the sample those things start. I can choose how long that sample is. I can scale that as well, so kind of make it twice as long or half as long. I've just found in my exploration that's a really handy control to have. And then what I do have is I've got some sources, some mod sources impacting upon that, but we'll come back to those. Those two pulses are kind of, so this is the kind of pulse engine, as it were. You get your kind of, I get my kind of MIDI information, processing that MIDI information. I've got a few things here disconnected. I'll show you those in a bit. And I'm essentially, I get my MIDI note, that turns into a phaser ramp. A phaser ramp then plays through the sample, and I can split that phaser ramp up, and I get pulse A and pulse B. What I also have, I'm doing some clever stuff with each of those pulses. These are called ramp in and ramp out. So you will see, and I have controls for those here. That is about shaping the front and the end of the pulse of each sound. And that helps with clicks and pops in terms of non-zero kind of sample points. And also it can help shape the sound as well, which can create some kind of interesting effects. I have an ADSR envelope, which is shaping the overall amplitude. I have a low pass filter, which at the moment is just set to 12,000 space, so you're doing pretty much nothing. And then what I have is I have a whole bunch of sources of modification, so a whole bunch of mods happening. So let's walk through a few of those, because I've kind of been playing a lot with this, and some of them I currently have mapped as MPE, different kind of functions on the Rolly. Some of them also I think could be really interesting to map to different hand gesture controls in terms of X and Y coordinates, Z coordinates. I think there's some opportunity here to explore how hand controls might map with some of these as well. So one source of mod I've got is the pulse width. So this is about how much of pulse A, how much of pulse B, or silence do you hear. And at the moment I have that mapped to the slide position on the keyboard. So let's just record a couple of samples. So in the middle of the keyboard there, I am getting 50-50. At the top of the keyboard, I'm getting a little bit more of pulse A than I am of pulse B. And there at the bottom of the keyboard, I'm getting a little bit more of pulse B and a little less of pulse A. So that's one source of mod. I also have a little LFO, just creating a little bit of variation in terms of where within the sample each pulse starts. So it's a really small amount, fairly slow, and it's just creating a little bit of variation about the sample start. It's an approach that's used really widely in granular synthesis to create kind of interesting textures, and so I've just brought that in here as part of pulsar synthesis, just to bring that. Another technique that I am using and borrowing from granular synthesis is the idea of some randomization of the volume of each grain. So I've got a 50% randomized volume here, and then also some randomization on the panning of each grain, or in this case, pulse of sound. So each pulse of sound, I'm generating a whole bunch of random numbers, and they are then being assigned to a pan position so that each pulse of sound comes from a slightly different place. It helps to create a sense of kind of immersion and stereo and being surrounded by the sound rather than it coming from straight in front of you. I have got a sample start ADSR mod, and so this is about an ADSR envelope changing that start position. At the moment, and with the example we've had so far, that's not doing anything because I've turned the amount right down, but let me give you an example of how that might work. So if I just slow this attack down, you'll hear really clearly, hopefully. So that is moving through that. And let's turn the LFO off on that completely so you can really hear it. And if I bring the sustain level down, it'll come back. And actually, let's make that happen over a slower period. So what we should do is move through that sample, move back. My light's gone out. Give me a second. Okay, we're back. So, I've got an ADSR envelope that can move through the sample, and I can do that separately for pulse A and pulse B. And I think, in terms of sources of mod, that leads us just to the last ones. So that leads me to talking about a couple of features that I've been building in that are inspired partly by this idea of the hands moving away from the keyboard and what are some of the things that software could do for us in terms of creating musical patterns and ideas without having to play the keyboard. And then secondly, I think really inspired by this process of creating this synth and really discovering what I think is perhaps most interesting about this approach to synthesis, which is that there is a blurring of the boundaries between frequency and rhythm, particularly at low octaves. And what this really reminds me of is a really interesting kind of metaphysical article or series of articles which I was reading at the end of last summer around the idea of debating whether sound has a unique relationship to time, or whether it is simply an abstract property of spatio-temporal regions, right? Sounds belong to a particular space and time. They are descriptions of a particular space and time rather than being some particular unique phenomenon that with a unique relationship to time. And I think it's really interesting, and I think to me this is the place where this synth is perhaps most interesting, because you start to blur the boundaries between what is a sound and what is a sequence of sounds. And in doing so, alongside thinking about how can hand control be most useful and kind of have a really interesting kind of musical output, I kind of stumbled into this sense of sequencing. And what's interesting about the kind of heart of this synthesis engine is the way this works is that to get a higher pitched sound, you play the sample a little bit quicker. And so if you start to play sequences of notes, you also get sequences of rhythms. At higher frequencies, those are outside of the kind of perceptible range, but as we bring those down into lower frequencies, they start to become audible, identifiable sequences of rhythm, alongside being also sequences of pitch. And perhaps what I should do now is set up an example of that, and let's have a listen. So in that example there, what I had working here was this little 10-step sequencer, and I'm simply working in octaves there. And you can see that kind of creates that very distinctive rhythm, a kind of doubling of frequency, therefore a doubling of speed. And that kind of creating very, particularly as I came down and started to play a further octave down, really noticing that really kind of clear sense of connection between rhythm and pitch. I do also have something working that allows me to do that. This little kind of 5-step sequencer kind of in semitones. So let's just have a quick look at that. that is a little walkthrough of where I've got to so far. I think there are some really exciting possibilities for where this could go next. In terms of my own personal expression as an electronic musician, I think there's some really interesting examples of work that has been done and work that is left to be done around, for me, what is such a core focus of that expression as an electronic musician, particularly when I think about improvisation, about having a palette of sounds that are capable of drawing from, resonating with, and shaping unfolding improvisations. And I think what is so exciting is there's a really clear sense of being able to draw from with that live sampling. I think there is still plenty of work to be done in terms of that kind of sense of shaping without domineering. I like to use scales from music therapy and start to think about the extent to which there is leadership versus following. And I think one of the key phrases I've been working with is this idea about something being wieldable. And I think there's still work to be done in terms of this synth and this engine being able to be fully capable of being wieldable in a range of improvisation settings. Secondly, I'm really excited by this kind of gesture control and where this is moving into, and I think there's potential there for public engagement for non-musicians, and a kind of wider engagement piece around engaging with this technology and it being an immersive technology and an interactive technology that could have some really exciting kind of sonic art applications. So I think that that's really exciting too. But that's where I'm at so far, and I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. If this has sparked any thoughts, questions, if there's anything you'd like me to show in more detail, if there's anything you'd like me to talk about more, please get in touch.